Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Well, I'm delighted to welcome David Hinchliffe to the Talent Equation. David, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Delighted to be here.
This is the second time we've spoken in a recording capacity, isn't it? Because I think, on either one of your first, anyway, podcasts, because you do a couple of them, don't you?
Yes, yeah. You were the first one on an occasional podcast called "You Are Not Alone, Coach," which is sort of a very short podcast about trying to give some cricket coaches ideas about, something they can do to improve the session that they're going to have that day. So it's just on one topic. So, short and sharp. You can listen to it in the car on the way to the ground, and then you can use some of those ideas. So that's the idea behind it, anyway. And
then the other one that you do with a couple of colleagues as well. Probably worth just sort of mentioning that as well.
That's right. That's called the Pitch Vision Academy Cricket Show, and that is with two, as I call them every week, two very fine cricket coaches. So I feel like my job in that is just to wind them up and let them go. And that's, again, it's all cricket coaching based, and or advice for players as well, I suppose, in there. And that is Mark Garraway, who is famous in cricket coaching circles for being a total badger, a very good coach. And Sam Lavery, who is working in Portsmouth Grammar School, doing a great job down there. So, the three of us, we try and do our best to help people out. And, whether we do that or not, I can't say, but we certainly do our best every week to do that.
Well, it's fantastic to be speaking to a fellow podcaster. But one of the things I was going to say to you is we've jumped straight in here, and people have probably already realised that you're quite heavily involved in cricket coaching.
Yes.
But I haven't asked you to kind of tell everybody about your kind of backstory and how you've arrived at what you're doing now.
How I arrived? Oh, well, it's the classic story, isn't it? You loved playing sport as a kid, and you just realised that that's the thing that you wanted to do as time went on. And initially, when you're younger, you think, oh, great, I'm going to play for England one day. And then as you slowly realise that's probably not going to happen, you push your sights back to playing professional sport, and then back to playing first 11 club sport. And then eventually you get to the point that you can do it. And then you think to yourself, oh, okay, well, I want to help other people as well. And I think that was the big motivator for me, was that I thought I enjoyed training myself as a player, but what I really want to do is I want to help others reach their potential. And that's what I did my first coaching badge off the back of our club coach saying, you should do that when I was 18. And it was during the holidays, and I thought, why not? I'm just going to do it. And I haven't really looked back since. That was well over 20 years ago. And I've been coaching all over the place ever since, in my spare time initially, but for the last 10 years as a full-time cricket coach. So it's been great fun. But it all came from really just being the kid down at the cricket club and just not wanting to stop playing cricket when it got dark. That's how it all started.
And you're based up in Scotland, is that right?
Yes, that's right, yeah. One of my many hats is head coach of West of Scotland Cricket Club in Glasgow, which I think that probably says a lot about me as a person, in that I've picked literally the worst place in the UK to play cricket, to apply my trade. There's nowhere it rains, no city it rains more in the UK than in Glasgow. we're right in the heart of the West End of Glasgow. So it's a fantastic challenge.
And I suppose the other challenge you've got is it's been particularly this winter, we've had months of near Arctic conditions as well that you've had to contend with.
Fortunately, we have at West a indoor cricket school. So whoever decided to put a roof on the nets in 1954 when they were built was a genius, right? Literally nobody else who did that. So although it was very cold in there because there's no way of heating it. So it's probably about 5 degrees in there most days during that cold period. We just got on with it. We just got stuck in and got on with it. And it probably only had 2 sessions cancelled the whole time that we were snowed. So I'm not complaining about that. That was okay. But it has put our preparations back quite a bit for the start of the season. Yeah. We haven't been able to play. We were scheduled to have 6 pre-season matches, and we've managed 1, and the league starts on Saturday. So that means that we are a little bit undercooked, but I feel like in that situation we're ahead of everybody else because we have actually managed to do some practice. Not ideal practice, indoor nets. It's one of my bugbears is in nets, especially indoors. It's not a particularly good way of practicing for cricket, but it's better than doing nothing, which is what a lot of other people have done around this time. So I'm feeling confident.
That's actually a really good jumping off point, I suppose, for our conversation as well, because as you know, I'm moving up an age group this year, having done the under 9s for the last 3 years, and I've got 40 odd under 9s who are coming along regularly on a Friday night, which brings its own challenges. Sort of me and 3 or 4 other helpers. But in terms of the work you're doing, I imagine, firstly, the temperatures in there mean that you have to do a lot of kind of adapted work, I imagine, with a lot more movement than perhaps you would ordinarily do. And then the second piece is around the indoor nets. How do you adapt your methodology to ensure that you're getting kind of your practices as representative as it can be?
Do we need to explain the concept of indoor nets for people?
That's a good point, yeah, because there's actually some people listening who are probably thinking, what the hell are they talking about?
I guess if you're in America, you think the stupid sport of cricket where, everybody wears the same uniforms and nothing happens for 5 days. What difference does it make what practice you do?
Yeah.
But no, I mean, obviously we play shorter format cricket. Only lasts, much shorter. Anything between 20 overs is about 3 hours, something like that, and 50 overs is 7 hours. That's all done in one day. But so in terms of practice, the traditional way of practicing cricket is to string up some netting, and then you have your bowler bowl and your batsman bat. And when the batsman hit the balls, hopefully the ball stays inside the netting, although not always.
Yeah.
And then that can be inside or outside. Obviously, cricket's an outdoor game for the most part, but you can practice inside because, especially in the UK, especially in the north of the UK, you're going to spend a lot more time indoors practicing than you are outdoors. So, that's where that net practice, that word net practice, comes in.
Yeah.
And so, we are very, to use a term that is of the moment, we are very constrained by having 2 lanes of indoor nets. That means 2 people can practice at the same time, and that's it. Very short run up, and you can't really do anything else. The nets are fixed; they don't move. So you've just got to practice your batting and your bowling. You've got your 22 yards, a short run up, and that's all you've got.
Yeah.
So we're constrained by space. We're constrained by run ups, and we're constrained by how many people we can have in there at once, because if you've got more than about 8 people in there, it becomes very, very crowded, and you don't get a very good amount of time to practice your batting, which of course, you can bat for up to 2.5 hours in a game of cricket, but in a net, you might, if you're lucky, you might get half an hour, and most of the time it's 10-15 minutes.
Yeah.
So, right, going back to the question then.
Yeah.
So you were asking me, how does it affect the way that I coach, I suppose? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, and I suppose it's a question in 2 parts. We can take it in 2 parts. One is, how do you adapt? And the second one is, how do you ensure that your practice is as representative as it can be?
Yeah. There's how I adapt is kind of two parts to that. The second part, I'll start with the second part, which is there's a natural adaptation that happens. And if you know how to manage that, I call that standard nets, which we've talked about before. Yeah. If you manage that, then that can happen naturally without you having to do too much. You have to sort of manage how people are thinking about it, really, rather than what actually happens. And that is where you have one batsman, maybe 3 or 4 bowlers, and everybody bowls in turn, and the batsman does their best to hit as many as they can.
Yeah.
Now that is a very sort of unfocused way of practicing, and I've said this on one of my other podcasts in the past, is that your standard net practice in that situation is a really advanced way of practicing, but we all treat it as the most simple way of practicing. And it's advanced because it requires a lot of mental effort to get yourself in the right space to practice with a little bit of purpose and think to yourself, right, okay, what am I doing here? What am I working on specifically here? Yeah. And that means because you can't work on technique, for example, because, the bowler's not going to bowl the ball to you exactly where you want it, so you can hit the ball in a certain way into a certain space. And you can't even really see whether you've done that properly or not. It's very hard to work on technique. So really it becomes a default thing to start thinking to yourself, okay, right, well, what situation am I playing here? What context am I playing in here? What am I trying to achieve here? How many runs am I trying to score here? And then it just becomes a challenge of how you manage that. How do you say to a player, okay, well, as a bowler, how do we stop him from scoring runs? And as a batsman, how do you score as many runs as you can in the time you have available based on the context that we've set? So that's the whole thing around that standard nets thing. And then the other thing is you can start to get clever, and you can start to say to people, okay, well, let's put some cones down. Let's start hitting the ball into those cones rather than just saying, oh yeah, I definitely hit that one for 4 because I hit it really hard. Mm-hmm. Well, in real life, you might hit the ball really hard straight to a fielder, and that fielder's the best fielder on the team, and he stops it easily. So we don't know that. So we've got to sort of artificially create that by setting down targets. Scoring areas is a great way of doing that. And then bowlers, we also set down targets for bowlers. Now, I'm not a big fan of target bowling, which is where the bowler bowls without a batsman there. I'm not a huge fan of that, purely because you're not getting to see what the response is to bowling the ball in different areas. So different batsmen will respond in different ways to different types of bowling. So you want to see how people respond to that. So I don't mind it a little bit, but what we use is, I'm going to do a little plug here for a product. Sorry about that, but we use pitch vision, which is a ball tracking system which the bowler runs in and bowls, and it just tracks exactly where the ball lands. And so we can have a look at that on the computer, and we can say to them, there's a video of it as well, and we can say, have a look at that length that you were bowling there. What do you think about how the batsman responded to that? And, was the batsman playing out of context? Did he try and smash it as hard as he could, even though we'd already said, listen, you've got a bad all day because you're opening the batting? And in which case that probably wasn't the kind of response that we're looking for from the batsman. But as a bowler, how do you deal with that? Because you will deal with that in a game situation. So there's a lot of conversations going on at the same time of that practice happening.
There's quite a lot of I think you've answered both questions there, actually, in terms of the representative question as well. But there's quite a lot of discussion going on about the use of things like video and VR and all those sorts of things, and the role it can play with, say, perception action coupling and those sorts of things. So in that case, in the use of that particular piece of software, is that kind of almost like instantaneous? So the bowler can literally almost deliver the ball and then can look at the software and then have a conversation with the coach based on what they're seeing in the video. It's almost instantaneous.
It is, I mean, it's as close to instantaneous as you can get. Within 2 seconds, if you bowl in the ball, it's on the screen. Wow. So you can see that immediately. The one thing I'm cautious of when we use video all the time, because we just set up the camera and it just automatically tracks every ball. So it literally tracks everything. If there's 700 deliveries in a session, which there may be, it gets every single one of them. So, but what we have to be careful of is people going down, when they look at the video, they go down the technique route. They go, I know what I did there. Look at my hands away from my body, or the bowlers, oh, look, I was falling away there, I need to stop. They start looking at the technical side of it. And I always try and caution people against that, because generally what happens is when something goes wrong, they go and look at the video and then they say, I know what I did wrong there. It's something to do with my technique. And actually, it might have been something to do with your technique, but what you didn't do was, let's take the example of a bowler falling away, right? When their head goes to the offside, when they're trying to stay well balanced as they deliver the ball. If that happens, they look at the bad ball they bowl and go, oh, I know what happened. I fell away on that one. But you didn't look at the other 20 good balls you bowled where you fell away as well, because that happens to be your bowling action. You didn't do it any more or less. You've just looked at the only one that went wrong. So you've got to be careful of it. And that's why I look more at outcomes and say, right, well, let's look at the outcomes here. How fast was that ball? What did that ball do off the pitch? How did the batsman respond to that? Rather than let's look at your bowling action and decide what's wrong with it. Let's say, right, well, based on what you can already do, how do we improve your consistency or your accuracy or your speed or the amount of turn you get or things like that, So, you start from a place of how do we get better, not how do we fix faults.
So that's really fascinating. So I'd like to, if you're willing, I'd like to delve into that methodology a little bit more in terms of the approach you might take to kind of, I guess, guiding somebody towards, a kind of a way of them improvement rather than fault correction. What's the approach you might take? Because obviously, like you say, you've got this external piece of feedback in video and you're almost saying to them, don't look at that. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on something else. So what's the approach you take?
Well, yeah, don't look at that is even that is probably something I wouldn't say. What I would direct, if they were a bowler, let's say they're a bowler,
yeah,
I would direct them to say, what did the batsman do there?
Okay.
So you're looking at, you're immediately saying, okay, well, how are we going to improve based on the response of the person at the other end, not based on something that you did. Yeah. So, it might be that you bowled a perfectly decent ball, nice little on the length away swinger. A guy hoofed it over mid wicket for 6. And you're like, okay, well, is that a bad ball that you bowled? Is that just a really good batsman? Did he get lucky? Did he close his eyes and swing and just manage to hit it? What's happening there? And we always try and keep it within context. So it's a lot of conversations, a lot of questions, a lot of exploring around how can we make that better? What do we need to do to improve that? And really really hard, because cricket is a very technical sport. So people naturally lean in towards technique. But when you're talking about working with players, especially club players, and even what I suppose you would call talent ID guys. So guys who are, 14 to 16, they're playing club cricket, but they're in a pathway, they're playing representative cricket. Even those guys, you only get limited contact time with them. You only get so much time to work on technique, and big technical changes take a long time and a lot of effort. So, if someone comes up to me and goes, oh, I want to sort out my back lift. Well, that's not going to take 10 minutes in the nets, mate. It might take the whole winter. So do you really want to do that? Is that going to, what problem is that solving? How are we going to solve that problem? So in a way, it's sort of managing that expectation that people have, is that the coach will correct your technique, and keeping them on that, in that frame of mind of, it's not about correcting technique, but still being able to offer something. Because what you don't want is people saying, well, he doesn't do anything. All he does is ask me questions.
We'll talk. Let's go back to that, as it's a good one. It's interesting though, isn't it? Because there's you mentioned something that something that happened to me a long time ago. Is you said that cricket's a very technical sport. And I remember one of the England coaches when I was working in golf saying to me, that golf's a very technical sport, and golf is more technical than hockey, because they knew I was involved in hockey. Right. And I was like, hang on a sec. Sorry. Is it? I mean, so in a game of hockey, I'm hitting a ball right, with an implement. Okay, the ball's slightly bigger than in golf, but the ball is moving. And okay, yes, the stick might be slightly bigger. Well, it hasn't got a bigger head because a golf club's got an enormous head, but it might be slightly shorter perhaps. But it's moving, and there are other people stopping me from doing it. And I've got to hit the ball to somebody else who might be moving. Or I've got to hit the ball to a goal, for example, and hit it in a particular area whilst I'm unbalanced on one leg and all these sorts of things. And not only have I got to do that on one side of my body, I've got to do it on the other side as well, because we play on it, we can hit the ball on the other side. So it's like, tell me how that's less technical than golf, where the ball is completely still and this, that, and the other. So I'm not sure it's necessarily that the sports like cricket and golf are necessarily more or less technical. I think they lend themselves to thinking technically because of the kind of semi-closed nature of them. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I would say that. In fact, as you were telling me that story, I was thinking to myself, probably saying it depends. I mean, we're going back and back here, but if it goes back to what is your definition of technique, and if you're just saying, well, technique is simply a movement that solves a problem, then all sport is technical.
Exactly.
But I think probably what I meant by a technical sport is that it's traditionally technique in isolation has been focused on very strongly. You look at the MCC coaching book. Yeah. Your classic, what is it? I've got it here somewhere. Yeah, there it is. 1954, exactly how to do everything in cricket that you need in a slim volume that you can read. And, people still, you see it on the TV when you watch cricket on the TV and you say, oh, that was straight out of the manual. Straight out of the manual is what they say. And it is straight out of the manual. I've got the manual here right in my hands right now, right? It's, a 1960 edition of the 1954 book. And it is straight out. Those shots are straight out of that manual. And then, but if someone plays something which isn't in that manual, they say, oh, that's unorthodox.
Unorthodox, yeah.
It's not in the manual. Well, that manual was last published in, I think, the late 60s. And MCC did a follow-up called MCC Masterclass, which was in the 90s, which was another book which started to take the emphasis. Even then, even in the sort of early 90s, it started to take the emphasis from there's one way to do everything, and this is how you do it, and this is what everyone should do. And it started to lean into players saying, well, look, this is how I did it, and they got in some guys who, like Viv Richards, the classic sort of successful yet unorthodox in inverted commas player, to talk about how he batted and things like that in that book. And that was in the early 90s. Even then, even the MCC, who are the upholders of the right way to do something, the proper way to do something, even they were changing in the early 90s. And so now when someone comes to me and says, oh, I want to make sure that my technique is perfect, you have to ask, well, what is perfect? What's perfect? Because if you're trying to get the answer from a book that was written in the 50s, then you're not going to do very well playing 21st century cricket. But you have to present that in a way that is appealing to players who that's their framework that they're working from. So you don't want to completely bust that by saying, right, everything you thought was completely wrong. Let's do it my way. You have to break that in a nice way and in a slow way and say things like, okay, but let's talk about the tactical situation that we're batting in here, because you might not want to play the forward defensive if you have to score 20 off the last over.
Yeah.
How are we going to do that? And that's the way that I would present it to people to try and get that.
So you're always contextualizing as much as possible. One of the ways I suppose you create representation is creating a context of some kind, whether it's an imagined context or it's through, like you say, kind of directing where, for example, a delivery might be bold, or not directing, sorry, it's the wrong phrase, but kind of creating some parameters around where a delivery might be bold or where a batsman might try and be able to score, and challenging them in ways to come up with the solution to be able to that sort of can successfully achieve that particular problem that you've presented.
And that's where I have an issue, I suppose, with nets, in that why should you have to go through all that mental work of trying to imagine things when you could just have a game of cricket? But there's this huge, excuse me, sorry, there's this huge problem around players want to have nets because that's what they see, that's what practice is. And if you say, okay, we're going to go into the middle and we're going to set a field and we're going to play a 5-over scenario here where we actually see what happens when you hit the ball, then people say, oh no, it doesn't really work for me. And I've literally had players, I mean, these are senior players who have done things in a certain way for years. So let's get the context right. But I've literally had players say, I'm not doing this, I'm leaving, and having left the session because they didn't get to bowl in a net. They didn't want to bowl with fielders. But that's a game of cricket. We've got, obviously the time is the big constraint there, that you can't play a full game. And also you want to make sure that your batsmen get the right amount of practice. So you don't want, if you're out first ball, that might be your only practice for the whole week. So you've got to build in certain things, rules. Small-sided games, I suppose, is the word that you would use in other sports. Different ways of doing it. But let's get out the nets. Let's get in the middle as much as we can within the lots of different issues around that. And I won't go into them, but there's lots of issues around being able to do that. But let's do that as much as we can. And that is, that then allows you to recreate the game as closely as you can and get that feel for, I am hitting the ball into a space here rather than into, towards a fielder, that kind of thing.
So there's a few things that you're making me think about that actually resonate really closely with some of the discussions that I had when I was over in Ireland recently at the Movement Skill Acquisition Conference. And one of the things that Keith Davids talked about, and it was fantastic to not only listen to him talk, because I've never actually heard him talk before, but also actually informally spend time with him, wandering through Cork and just chewing the fat about various things. Brilliant. And it's a unique opportunity. But a couple of things that he said that I think are probably particularly worth mentioning here is he talked about something he called, and so I'm going to get using the old technical language which we've been debating recently about how to use, but he talked about using kind of a landscape of affordances. So what I mean by that is, there are lots of opportunities for action, aren't there? And so he described it, or at least I conceived of it as, if you imagine, like there's, I imagine one of those landscapes where there's, where they've got the dry stone walls and the gates, and there's lots of little fields, and you've got different things in those fields. So if you have all the gates open, then all of the fields are available to you. And in a full game of cricket, you've got every affordance available, haven't you? You've got all the different fielding combinations, the strategy, tactics, and everything else. So all of those things are live. He said, but it is perfectly feasible to close some of those gates because of, you might want to focus in on a particular way of scoring, or a particular, at one side of the wicket, for example. So, you might close off one side of the wicket with a net, for example, mightn't you?
Yep.
But the other side of the wicket completely open. So that would close a number of the gates in the landscape, so that those fields are no longer available to us to enter into. So now we're looking at some other fields. But what that does is that sort of controls where our attention's focused. And it does provide an opportunity to explore things in a different way. Because one of the challenges when you work with all of the fields open is you get so much variability that you don't ever really get the opportunity to kind of focus on something, a particular problem that needs solving. So, for example, if a batsman is really struggling to score runs, say on the offside, then closing the leg side to them forces them to only score runs on the offside, assuming deliveries are bowled in the right place. And it just gives them more opportunities to play in that landscape. So I think it's kind of, what it was interesting to me is that, because I've been debating this quite a lot with people, is, there's almost this kind of purist approach, which is we should have all the affordances always available to us all the time. Otherwise, it's not truly representative. But actually, methodologically, using a constraints-led approach, the constraints-led approach would suggest to us, actually, no, there are definitely times when you want to close off some of those areas, because you actually do want to constrain in order to make people focus their attention somewhere else. How does that resonate with you?
Oh, completely. We do that all the time, and partially that's because you are the environment that you're in forces that to happen.
Yeah.
If you want to, the classic one is the battle zone cricket. Have you heard of that one?
I think I have. Yeah, I've seen it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, we did it last year, although we put cones out instead of a fence because it's 3 hours to put a fence out. So I'm not doing that.
Does that want to be in Renshaw's games?
No, that was. Do you know what? I saw him present at a recent
the one we were at, wasn't it?
Coaches Forum. No, the Cricket Scotland one. And I've totally forgotten his name. A really nice guy, Aussie guy who lives in the UK now. He's up in Northumberland somewhere. Oh, can't remember. Anyway, apologies if you're listening. Right. Anyway, yeah, battle zone cricket. The idea of that is you put a fence around the 30-yard circle on the pitch, and you play on a cricket pitch, and you have 5 fielders and 2 batsmen, and the batsmen have to score as many runs as they can within that sort of much smaller field than you would normally have, because a cricket field normally would be much wider than a 30-yard circle around the middle. So, and then that works on you placing the ball into gaps and running and calling and communicating with your teammate, and it helps the fielders work together and be sharp, and they get a lot of touches of the ball, and the bowlers get to work on, okay, when the batsman's trying to score off every single ball, how does that change the way I bowl, all that kind of thing. And you get that whole, you don't really have to do any coaching, any traditional coaching as such. You just say, just try and score off every ball, away you go. And then you have a very specific purpose to that. Everyone has a job to do, and you're just going about doing it. So that's an idea. You're closing off. I mean, you're literally building a wall there. So that's where the analogy is actually the reality, isn't it? So, my question, I guess, my follow-up question to that, and you can play around with that as much as you want within that area. But my question to you is, how many of those gates can you close off before it starts becoming useful? Because I'll give you the example of fielding drills, right? Yeah. Fielding drills where you're working on taking a high catch, for example, and everybody lines up and they take one catch in turn, and then they go to the back of the queue. Yeah. Well, A, that's probably not your best use of your time. But B, that ball's coming to you. You got a good chance of catching it. Roughly, what the coach looks like when he's hitting the ball, as opposed to, the batsman could have made all kinds of crazy movements. Yeah. You're not working. There's no anticipation. There's no game sense. There's no staying on top of the game, even when you haven't touched the ball for half an hour. All that kind of stuff is not recreated. So you've got that very simple drill, which you've got variability in it, obviously, because the ball goes in different directions, because no coach can hit the ball perfectly to the fielder every time, things like that. Yeah. So there's variability in there, but have you closed off too many gates in that? Do you have to open up a couple more gates to make that useful or not?
And that's for the coach to determine, isn't it? Yeah. So my instinctive response would be, just having said that, is that you definitely, in my opinion, I wouldn't want the players to necessarily know the ball was coming. So I think you do want some of the aspect of surprise, because there is the, oh, it's coming to me moment, isn't it? Yep. You probably also, I imagine, want to build some element of communication between players around whose ball it is. Mm-hmm. Because that's quite realistic in terms of under a high catch, often 2 players or 3 players are converging on the ball, and more often than not, that's what creates the drop catch, is the distraction of the other players converging, isn't it? Yep. So I imagine in order to maintain a degree of representativeness, you'd want that. So you'd want to keep that one open, and then I imagine you would also you'd want to have, I would possibly have varied heights. So, I mean, you're going to get natural variation in terms of the height of the ball anyway, but I think I would want, I would definitely want more movement, because I think generally, even when you have variability in terms of the coach not hitting the ball, I mean, coaches use these small bats now, don't they, so that they can hit it with a bit more accuracy. And generally speaking, like you say, the players don't always have to move that much. And so they can be a bit more accurate. Well, I would deliberately want different trajectories of ball flight. I'd want balls that are going over the top and landing short, and to get that kind of perception action coupling of judging the distance in and all that sort of stuff. And then the final piece as well is I'd actually want to layer a consequence onto, whichever way you do it, around trying to score a number of points, gamify it, get a number of points for every catch, or if it's a harder catch, you get bonus points, and the player might be able to, or it might be that they're getting minus points if they drop, or whatever it might be, and create an element of competition with another team, perhaps. Now, that's not quite as representative, but it does layer a bit of pressure on in order to somehow be representative of the kind of pressure a player might feel under a high ball with, when the game's on the line, so to speak.
Yeah, and I suppose each one of those, going back to that analogy, each one of those is as a gate that you can open or keep shut.
Exactly.
So I agree with all of those. I guess my question, the thing I'm not sure about at the moment really is how many of those gates do you close before it stops being useful and just starts being activity for the sake of activity?
I guess that depends on the capability of the performer, because sometimes all of those variables, you might call them constraints if you like, all of those variables might create too much chaos for a performer. I'm thinking of a beginner particularly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, personally, I would always try and I think it's important to be learning in as representative a context as possible, even if that creates a degree of failure. However, you may find that there's too much going on for a particular individual. Like there's too much information. Therefore, you might want to reduce some of those variables down. For example, you might not play with the pressure game. You might give them enough. So the way you talk about whole part whole. I don't often go to the part. Often people, I think, often is an isolated thing. So it would be in this context, you might have the full-on hardcore pressurized catching game, and in between that, you'd have. If you wanted to do the part, they'd just get the kind of repetitive hit and they get lots of goes at receiving, and they'd work on a technique of cupping their hands or whatever it might be. And then we go back to the full chaos game. So I don't talk about whole part whole in that context. I would go whole, less whole, if that makes sense. And I'd be tweaking the variables a bit like it's like a graphic equalizer almost, to try and work out where the sweet spot is, where the players can cope with the level of variability and get some level of success whilst it not being too easy for them, and then they lose focus and engagement.
There's two big challenges to that from my point of view. Coming from the players is the second one is that players want to touch the ball a lot. So when it comes to fielding, they want to touch the ball a lot because they think if I do 10, that's good. If I do 100, that's really good.
Yeah.
And then it just becomes about chasing the volume. And I do think that people could easily slip into that. I guarantee if I'm coaching, there's 25 people there in a session, for example, I'll often break people out into different groups. And, I've got guys I know who are, a bit more clued up, and they can sort of lead those smaller groups. And I absolutely guarantee you, no matter what instruction I give them, they will always go back to lining up and taking high catches. Always. Every single time. I can't remember the last time I said, right, I want you to work on your low and flat catches in the ring, please. Okay, we'll do that. 5 minutes, turn around, they're taking high catches. Every time. Because it's the easiest, simplest, you just default back to lining up and taking high catches. And then the other challenge there is that time is a huge part of fielding. You spend something like 90% of your time fielding doing nothing, literally doing nothing. But you have to be ready to do something brilliant, even if you've done nothing for 2.5 hours. Yeah. So, and I don't know any way you can recreate that in practice without just completely wasting the session. Right. We're all going to stand for an hour and I'm going to hit you one catch. It could be anyone though.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, and I try and do things like I keep a ball in my pocket, and no matter what we're doing, I'll shout at someone and I'll say, catch this. And they turn around and obviously, make sure that they're ready for it before I throw it at them. But that little bit of surprise, and I might do that twice in a whole session. just trying to do something to get that time thing. Because other than playing, there's no way of getting used to that idea of doing nothing for great tracts of time, and then suddenly you have to do something.
I think what you've done there, though, I quite like what you've done there, because you're still creating that kind of element of surprise by having that ball in your pocket, and it could come out at any point.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, like you say, it would be the most worthless, miserable session, wouldn't it? To stand around all day long. There are definitely some. I think I get that. I mean, and look, this is where the limits of reality and creating reality sort of fall down, really. But like you say, if, for example, you had 5 players, 5 fielders, let's say, and you're hitting balls to 5 fielders, and let's imagine, that they don't know when it's going to come. That to me feels like, I know they're going to get way more. They know it's coming at some point, and they are tuned in, and they haven't gone to sleep yet, because it is, it's getting towards 6 o'clock and everyone's tired, and, it's, that's the hardest piece, isn't it? It's the hardest bit to get people focused, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So I totally get that. And I think it's very, very, very difficult to represent that. But like you say, you just get as close as you can.
Yeah, I think that's the key thing for me. And there is that time where you do have to say, right, we just need to imagine this, let's imagine this, because it's the only way to do it. I think in a sport like, say, football or rugby or hockey, you could set up that situation. You say, right, it's you versus you. This is what's happening. This is off you go. And you can create that situation, and it happens.
Yeah.
In cricket, you can't create that situation. You have to say to everybody, right, imagine this is the situation.
Yeah.
And that's why it takes a lot more brain work than if you've got a sport where you can just set it up. A lot more brain work. That makes it sound like people who play hockey are stupid. That's not what I mean. I mean, it takes a lot more imagination. You have to imagine things rather than things actually happening in front of you, and then do it. And that's where it can break down as well. Because if you get one person who hasn't bought into that, then it tends to fall apart quite quickly. And you see that a lot when you're doing a middle practice with fielders. You've taken the nets away and everybody's really focused for 4 overs, but then one of the fielders gets a bit bored and he stops trying and he lets the ball go past him, and he's like, oh, I can't be bothered anyway. And do you know what I mean? It suddenly starts to become, you've lost that, you're out of that zone of imagination now, and you're back into, oh, well, it's just training anyway, so who cares?
Yeah.
So that's a big challenge as well, and that takes, again, it just takes a lot of focus and people to buy into that. And if they don't, then you do struggle a little bit, and it can happen.
Have you ever used using consequence as a means by which to try and maintain the intensity and the focus? So either trying to use rules or competitiveness or whatever it might be to maintain the focus, because I think most coaches struggle with maintaining the kind of intensity and the focus that you're looking for in training, and very and players naturally want to drop. Have you ever used a consequence type approach to that?
Yes is the short answer. The results of that can vary wildly. If you get people who are a group who are sort of into that idea, then you can it definitely works. It definitely motivates people. But I was working with a group yesterday of school kids just in a games lesson, and most of them aren't even interested in being there, let alone playing cricket. And they're there because they've got to be. And it doesn't matter what motivational trick you use there. That group of kids, that certain group of kids who just do not want to be there, are not going to engage at all. So then you've got to come up with other strategies. So it depends who you're working with a lot. And people are really good at pretending, especially older people that I work with, adults, I mean, are really good at pretending to be doing something when they're not really.
Yeah.
And I don't mind. I often say, look, I don't mind if you pretend, as long as it looks like you're doing it. Because usually, if it looks like they're doing it, they are doing it, whether they care about the fact they're doing it or not. But yeah, you'll get a breakdown, and then you'll say, well, lads, we're not, what's going on here? And they'll say, oh, I just switched off for a minute, but don't worry, get back into it. And they do it again. You sort of in that loop of not not quite into it, not buying into it, and that whole idea of I think we've talked about before of going back to why are we doing this? What's the reason that we're doing this in the first place? It's forgotten a little bit because they've just turned up to trade. Look, I just want to come and hit some balls. Why are we doing all this stupid stuff with making up rules and points and things? All I want to do is hit some balls. And everyone who I coach knows if someone says to me, I just want to hit balls, they're not going to get a very polite reply. Because I'm going to say, okay, why? What's the reason for that? Oh, is there going to be the magical form fairy who's going to pass by while you're in the net and sprinkle her fairy dust on you and away she goes? Is that what's going to happen? Because it's not. You don't get into form by hoping you're going to get into form. You get into form by working on something. So let's think about what we're going to do, what specifically we're going to do here.
Yeah.
So yeah, if anyone who's from West who's listening knows, never say to David, I just want to hit balls. Never say to David, can we warm up with a game of football?
I love that. I got to be honest with you. I don't think there's anything wrong with that in at all. I mean, you've almost said that semi-apologetically. Probably not, but it feels like that. And I'm thinking, actually, I wouldn't apologize for that in the slightest, because we're here to learn. We're here to get better, and we're gonna. And I wouldn't be doing your job if you allowed people to do that. It's like allowing your kids to get away with poor behavior. It's like allowing your kids to, eat sweets all the time. You're not a responsible individual. It wouldn't be a responsible parent doing that. And likewise, these people are in my care, and part of my role as their caregiver is actually to help them improve. So I wouldn't be doing them any favors, and I wouldn't do it to them, if that makes sense, as much as they want it. Because basically what they want is junk food, don't they? They just want something that's going to be comfortable, going to make them feel a bit better. It's the equivalent of having a bar of chocolate. And it's not going to do you any good, though. And that's the danger sometimes. I think the difficulty we have as coaches that people don't realize is we're constantly actually giving what some players see as broccoli.
Yep.
And we have to continuously say, this is really good for you. And I know you don't particularly like it or want it, but this is really good for you.
Yeah, and it goes back again to that idea of saying, why are we doing this? What's the reason behind coming to training? Yeah. And if it's literally just, do you know what? I just want to spend a couple of hours with my mates, then that's fine. But at least we know why. At least we know why you're here.
Yeah.
And then for that person who says that and is honest about that, do you know what? I'm fine with that, because in that Mark Bennett way, you're not performance. Then are you? You're what's that word he uses?
Leisure.
Leisure. Yeah. Which is fine by me. It means I can give more attention to the guys who do want to have performance, and you can do whatever. I don't mind. Yeah. As long as you don't get in the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah.
And it's that idea of I struggle with this a bit. This idea of, especially when I got introduced into the idea of constraints-led stuff and sort of guided discovery and all that kind of thing. As I learned more about that, I thought, well, hang on a minute. What is the role of the coach then? If you just have to, set up the game and say, off you go, lads. Where does that leave the coach? But then that sort of comes into that idea of you don't want to instruct, in that old way. You don't want to say to people, hold the bat like this, hold the ball like that, do this, do that. But you don't want to completely abdicate. You don't want to say, it was nothing to do with me. Coaching is not neither of those two things. Coaching is that thing in the middle, or not even in the middle. It's that thing elsewhere that is sort of helping people to discover things for themselves.
Yeah, Keith Davids talked about that. Actually, it was a really useful framing. He had a slide that I think I tweeted at some point, where he talked about, you've got the instructional approach. Let's say that's on the left-hand side, and then you've got a pure discovery or pure exploration on the right-hand side, and the constraints-led approach. It's not over there in pure exploration, but it's definitely on the right-hand side of the screen, if you like, and it is about. It's definitely non-instructional, but there's more intention to the design of activity in order to help bring about or to help somebody discover than people probably think. They think it's just pure exploration, just play.
Yeah.
And your point about what's the role of the coach things is definitely something I think a lot of people struggle with. And I think you conceiving it as being, it's somewhere in the middle or right of center, let's say, I think is exactly the right way to conceive of it, because so in my mind, and I think something that people have sort of lost sight of as well, is the job is, I think sometimes the job is to help somebody, but I think partly most people see the role of the coach as someone who has knowledge that can give somebody a solution. So they want a solution.
Imparting a solution
exactly
that comes from elsewhere. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Whereas
yeah.
I see a coach as somebody who presents problems that encourage the individual to find ways of solving it. Now, they might not be able to find it on their own, in which case we might use a different intervention to help them solve the problem. But you're a problem creator, because then it has meaning. The learning has meaning immediately. Oh, there's a problem. I can't solve this problem.
Yeah.
And my little boy, in fact, last night he's on, cricket's happening, and he's, can we go up to the nets? Can we go up to the nets? And we played a little game
already.
Yeah, I know, he loves it. But he always wants to go to the nets. But we always play a game in the nets of some kind, or there's something. And so we were having a little game, and I asked him about it afterwards, and he says, "Yeah, I think the ball's coming to me, and it's coming, and I'm having to think about where I'm going to hit it and what I'm doing, and all those sorts of things." And I said, "Well, that's good, because you are thinking about those sorts of things." Because I presented him with a problem. The problem is he's got to score in a particular area, so he's coming away from that, and I can sort of hear him talking to me about the meaning he's derived from that particular problem, and he's said to himself, I need to do this now to make that happen. So for me, that was like, wow. And I'm still playing around with this stuff, to be honest. I'm still because the cricket side of things. I've been doing hockey constraints in hockey for much longer, so I feel like I've got much more of a comfort with that. Whereas in cricket, I'm still having to actively think about the constraints I might use in that context.
Yeah. I find that if you give people space to solve problems, they definitely can. But there are times when they will just straight up ask you, what do I need to do here? And sometimes you need to give an answer. I'm a self-employed coach. And so part of the thing you have to think about is you've got to make sure that people think they are getting coaching. And that means sometimes you have to say something that even perhaps you wouldn't necessarily say, but you want them to feel like I'm getting some value here.
Yeah.
So often what I will say is, if someone says, "Oh, what do I need to do to fix this problem?" Or how do I hit the ball over there? Or something very, very specific. I'll then say to them, "Well, I'll tell you what I've seen, and I'll tell you what has worked for other people who have had the same problem.
Yes.
But you need to work out if this is going to work for you. Shall we give it a try?"
That's brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah. And they'll say something like, "Okay, let's give it a try." And I'll say, "Right, try doing this on this next round." Okay. And then we'll do, if we're doing any work with the ball throw, with the slinger, I'll try and sling the ball in the right place, and they'll think about trying to hit the ball in a certain area by doing something. And there might be, in my mind, I might have 5 or 6 different movement solutions, and I'll just present one to them. And then if the one that I think is probably most likely to work, and then if it doesn't work for them, and then they know immediately, they'll say, "Oh, I can't get used to that. Okay, let's forget it. Let's do something else." And if they get it, they go, "Do you know what? This feels better. Right, let's explore it further."
Love it. I see. Now I don't know if people appreciate that is night and day from most people's experiences in this sport and most other sports like this.
Yeah.
Most coaches' response. In fact, we haven't got anywhere near this, by the way. We haven't even explored a movement solution at this point. We've already been given the technical information right at the start, usually. In context there, the idea of saying to somebody, "Well, I'll tell you what other people have found useful," or here's something that you might want to try. So they're actively involved in the choice of trying it. Is night and day from saying, "Well, what you're doing is you're moving your head." You're moving. If you just stop moving your head, you'll be fine.
Yeah,
I heard that the other day
as well. Unprompted. Yeah, is the other thing. That you're not waiting for someone to ask. Yeah. You'll just go, "Oh, I've seen a flaw. We must correct this flaw."
unsolicited feedback, I think, is really, really dangerous. I was watching this the other day. I was watching a session alongside me, right? So I'm there with my little boy, and I'm watching this activity going on, and all I'm hearing is unsolicited feedback, and I'm hearing the player say things like, "What happened there? What did I do then?" Now, my immediate response to that would be, "What do you mean? What do you think happened? And why aren't you aware of it?" And you should be telling me. The information needs to be coming from you to me, not me to you. I've got things I can see, and I can tell you whether I think what you think happened is what actually happened, but you've got to be the first person to tell me what happened.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So that's like completely abdicating feedback to someone else.
Yeah.
That's never going to help you in the middle, because you can't walk up to the umpire and say, "What happened there?"
Exactly. Yeah. What did you notice is a question that I will often ask people.
Yeah.
Especially in a one-to-one situation.
Yeah.
What did you notice? And that allows them to just get used to the idea that I'm not going to come up and start telling them something. I'm just going to ask them what they thought about it.
Yeah.
And often you'll say, especially if you're working with someone new, you might get them saying, "I don't know. What did you notice?" And then you've got to keep but you've got to be careful about asking too many questions, I think, because people do start to think, people do start thinking, well, he's just asking me questions here. He's not coaching me at all.
Yeah.
Even though probably coaching is, mostly questions, isn't it?
Well, I mean, they talk about tell and sell, and it's a slider, isn't it? And sometimes, yes, you can go in there and just sort of get, you can say, all right, you're struggling here. You're not, I get it, right? So you can offer something or give them a clue or whatever it might be. And I totally get that. I think your question is my favorite question as well. What do you notice? The reason I love that question is because there's no way of getting that wrong, apart from the only way of getting that wrong is to say, "Didn't notice anything." Well, you must have noticed something. And if you didn't notice anything, then maybe you're not paying enough attention to what's happening. So I tell you what, let's do some more, and then you can tell me what you noticed.
Yeah, I think even there you can say, okay, right. I think you can explore. I didn't notice anything. I think that's just someone a bit nervous about.
Yeah.
So I think you can explore that further. I mean, the one, especially with batsmen, what did you notice? I didn't notice anything. Well, where was the ball going? That suddenly that changes their mindset from, oh right, what was happening with my head and my hands and my feet there, and the bat, what was the angle of the bat, and all that stuff. Forget about that. Where did the ball go? Well, it went along the ground over there. Okay, well, that's a pretty good start, isn't it?
So they did notice something. They just probably weren't willing to divulge it.
Did you want it to hit it over there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. Okay. Well, why do you think you hit it over there so well?
Yeah.
So you could definitely follow up with a few things, and also I'll say, could you hit the same ball over there instead? And that makes people think, oh yeah, maybe. How can we do that? Okay, well, we can talk about that. So that's in more of a one-to-one situation. Yeah. In a group situation, you don't really get that opportunity very much. You might get two questions off before one kid starts chasing another one around with a bat. But you've got to, especially with adult players, you can really engage in one-to-one conversations quite well in those one-to-one situations.
It's very challenging, particularly when, I quite often trying to working with under nines and trying to help them learn to bowl, and we're often playing a game.
That's tough.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got lots of them, right? So they're in sort of teams of three, and we do play. We call it Champions League, and they're in teams of three, and they're bowling off against another team. There's no batsman, sadly, but it's just one of those things. And the one team that wins moves up, and the team that loses moves down. And it gets very exciting and engaging, and then there's lots of energy. And a big part of my mission in this scenario is really it's entertainment as much as it is about helping them develop. Yeah. But with those who struggle with the action, and a lot do, a lot of are throwing, and a lot are not really understanding anything about how the ball might come out of their hand or anything like that. It's really difficult. It is really difficult, and there are times when I do have to just, because I've got very limited time and I'm trying to give each one of them at least something that they can use to take away with them. It's very difficult to go into, like you say, a one-to-one sort of questioning scenario, where, however, I do, as much as possible, try and just say to them something along the lines of, when you do that next time, I just want you to think about where your hand is pointing, where the palm of your hand is pointing, for example. Just think about that. And then when I see you in a minute, come and tell me what you noticed. So that's just, and that might be the only thing that they get from that, because I've got to go around 30 or 40 players or less, you know. So, but I still think it's feasible for anybody listening who thinks, oh, I've got too many players, I can't possibly do that, I just need to tell them what to do.
Yeah.
I still think it's very possible to still use a kind of get the player involved in the thought process of it, rather than just say, you need to do this. Having said that, have there been times when I've actually shown somebody about keeping their arm straight, or got them to show me how they can keep their arm straight? Yeah, absolutely. I've definitely done that, which is probably more on that kind of instructional space. But in my mind, that I sometimes think that's justified given the constraints of the environment that I'm working in. I wouldn't do it if I wasn't constrained in that way.
I think the other difference with that is with the bent elbow, which is, you know, your classic, you're not allowed to throw it. You've got to keep your elbow straight.
Yeah.
That's a non-negotiable. It's one of the few things in cricket where you have to say, well, look, you've got to do, you can't bend your elbow, right? You've got to do this, right? So we do have to find a way to get this working. Otherwise, you just can't bowl. And you've got to bowl because everyone's got to bowl in these new formats.
Yeah.
So, you know, we've got to work out a way of doing that. So you've got to. So sometimes I think, you know, when it's something as clear cut as that, right? There's no wiggle room.
Yeah.
You know, pretty much every other thing in the bowling action you can negotiate over, but that one you just got to do it. You've got to do it. So. I think that's the sort of, that lives in its own little world, that straight arm. And of course it's very hard to get right as well, because, you know, your natural thing is to bend your elbow when you throw the ball.
Yeah.
When you bowl for the first time. But I do think that even there, you've got, because we were talking about that article about the Indian players, how they're more natural. I mean, a lot of uncoached Indian players, you know, they watch the heroes on the TV. They know you're not allowed to throw it, and they just go and bowl in the street with a tennis ball.
Yeah.
And they do all right, and they've never had a coach. So, you know, I'm not even there. I feel like, well, it's something that I don't know. I think possibly it's a bit like being a doctor, right? You've got to say first, do no harm, and sometimes that means saying nothing. Not just because you got the shirt on that says coach on the back of it, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to intervene. It might be that the kid just needs to work it out for themselves, easy most of the time, because, you know, look at the example of those guys in India, and they're working out for themselves because they don't have access to coaching, a lot of those kids.
Yes, except what we don't know is how many millions of Indians walk around the streets throwing the ball because they haven't worked it out for themselves.
Well, I can give you a very not evidence-based example of this, which is, I went to India a few years ago to do some coaching, and I went to Mumbai, and in Mumbai they have these great big playing fields called the Maidans, and I think this is the largest concentration of people playing sport in the world, because there's these huge fields with thousands and thousands of people playing cricket. And you can imagine, right, at 6 o'clock in the morning, sun starts to come up. They descend from all corners onto these three massive fields and play games of cricket next to each other, dangerously close next to each other. I'm not even just talking about overlapping boundaries. I'm talking about within 2 feet of the next game, there's a game going on with a tennis ball. It's just completely saturated with people. I can't think of anywhere where there's more people playing one sport in one place. And I walk around watching this. By the way, it gets to about 9 o'clock, and all these people clear off, and the proper games of cricket start. And the proper games of cricket have massive overlapping boundaries. You know, you can be fielding at mid wicket in one game and be almost standing on the pitch of another game. They overlap by that much. Even the games with a hard ball. Yeah. But I walked around in the morning. I watched dozens of games, hardball games being played later in the afternoon. And I can't think of one person who threw the ball the entire time that I saw. And I must have seen thousands and thousands of deliveries.
Is this kids or adults?
Every age. Every age. You know, you've got 3-year-olds running around. You've got, you know, guys well into their 50s running around. There's just every single possible age you can think of. And it's, you know, and everyone bowled. I mean, there were some crazy, crazy actions, but everyone kept that elbow straight.
See, that's interesting, that, isn't it? Because there's there's a study in there, isn't there? There's a PhD in there.
Yes.
Around, what are the kind of environmental influences? Because, out of my group of under nines, and something about kind of fundamental movement skill and movement development and things like that. Because out of my under nines, well, I suppose it probably links to the fact that I bet you even my little boy doesn't watch cricket. If he wants to play, he doesn't want to watch. And out of my under nines, I reckon probably 90% have probably never actually watched cricket played. Yeah. Whereas the difference in India is they all have, because that's what everyone does, isn't it? Again, I'm generalizing enormously, but so I imagine, like you say, you're picking up these things, and and you're working it out, or your older people are talking to you about the fact that the bowler bowls with a straight arm, and you're not allowed to bowl it without, and this, that, and the other. So they start to experiment to begin with and work it out, and this, that, and the other. Whereas my kids, they come to cricket and they do cricket on a Friday night for an hour, and that's the only cricket they're going to do. It's a big difference, isn't it? Yeah.
And you think of that, the example of Sachin Tendulkar, who great Indian batsman, who, I mean, that's the polar opposite of that was, I mean, it's changed slightly now, but this was in the 80s. He would bat in one game, and then when he got out, he'd just go to the next game and bat in that game. Then we got out, and he would bat all day. He would literally bat all day.
Yeah.
So
how many kids get that kind of shot, that sort of chance?
Exactly. So I do think, and I also think that even in these knock-up games of tennis ball cricket, they're taking it very seriously. They're competing against each other. I think anyone who doesn't bowl with a straight arm just wouldn't play. They're just, you're not you can't play because you're chucking it, mate. Just go do something else, or learn how to bowl, with a straight arm.
So you go away and work on it so you can play.
Yeah. So and even in those knock-up games on the street, you're not playing unless you can bowl.
Yeah.
So, that's why I think, batting techniques probably very much more, because you don't have that constraint of, you have to do something. In batting, you don't have to do anything apart from hit the ball.
Yes.
Whereas in bowling, you've got a physical movement constraint based on you, which you have to do. So my theory is that it's partially the environment, and it's partially almost the cultural expectation that you're going to be into cricket, and B, watch cricket, and C, play cricket.
It's very noticeable actually amongst the group of those 40 players. There'll be 10, and they can do it. They can do most of the things that involve cricket, but they've usually got a big brother who's played already, or they've got a dad who's involved or has been involved in cricket and clearly is involved in them playing in the garden and learning how to do things and all those sorts of things. And the others are kids who just come to cricket because cricket's one of the things that they do in a week.
Yeah.
And all that sort of stuff. So, there's a sort of an obligation to almost be the garden dad for some of those kids because they've never been given any even exposure before, or any concept of it. It's interesting. They get it quite quick.
Yes, most do. Yeah, there's always one or two who just can't quite fathom it out, and that I think that's the big challenge on that one. But once you've got it, you're like, oh, okay, I see now, and then away you go.
Yeah. Right. Well, look, I could talk all day long, David. I love the game. I always have. I haven't even started talking to you about how I used to put pounds on the stumps when I was growing up, and to get my brother to bowl at me from 14 yards. But that's another story for another day.
Natural constraints, yeah.
Exactly. Well, I was doing, basically what I realised was I was doing constraints-led coaching to myself before I even knew what it was. I used to bat with a stump, and all that sort of stuff. And anyway, whatever. So
it's the whole back garden thing. My story is you couldn't pull the ball because if you pulled the ball, it would go through the kitchen window.
Yeah.
So I have a beautiful cover drive, and an absolutely terrible pull shot.
So I was exactly the same. When I met my friend's garden, you couldn't pull the ball because the hedge was there and you lose the ball. So all the shots were played to the offside. All the shots on the F. If you want to stop me from scoring, bowl on my legs.
Yeah,
I can pull the ball. I can pull the ball, but I can't play a leg glance.
Yeah. Well, there you go. You only play on the posh side. You're like me. You only play on the posh side.
Listen, I've loved that conversation. I'm really glad we could do this. We've already talked about some of the stuff you're doing in the in the broadcast space, but I know you're fairly active on Twitter. How do people find you?
On Twitter, it's at David Hinchliffe, which is probably most people misspell because there's lots of room for error in there. Yeah. So if you're struggling to do that, then head over to david25.com. That's my website, david25.com, and you can find all my details on there.
Great stuff. I have to say, I do have to sometimes cognitively think about how to spell your name because I want to call you Hinchcliffe all the time.
Yeah. There's an E in there which probably shouldn't be there. There's one C. It's all over the place. 2 Fs. It's completely stupid. But if you can't find me, it's the profile that says professional dum dum because that's what I feel I am.
Well, you and me both. But the more I explore in this space, the more I learn how much there is to learn. So, and in actual fact, that's one of the pieces. That's one of the things that keeps me coming back. It's almost that feeling of never quite mastering, and I'm somehow attracted to those kinds of things. So, that's one of the reasons I like these conversations.
Well, I dread the day that I think to myself, right, that's it, nailed it. What's next? Because what am I going to do in my life then? So I really hope that never happens because I'm either completely deluded or, I'm the greatest coach of all time. So, but either way, I'll probably have to find something else to do. So I hope that never happens.
Brilliant stuff. Brilliant. Right. Well, all the best. And I hope your summer is better than the winter has been. Dearly hope that.
Crossing everything. Don't worry about that.
And then maybe at the end of the season, it might be worth jumping back on and comparing notes on how things have gone.
Yeah, great. Be glad to. Anytime, Stu, anytime.
Brilliant. Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.
So there you have it. Great conversation with David there. He's got a great voice, hasn't he? You can tell he does podcasts, very silky smooth, and he really gets his point across brilliantly. I love his idea around standard nets. Although I think his idea of standard nets is not very standard. I think his idea of standard nets is a fairly advanced form of practice, creating scenarios and always trying to contextualize everything. And even if it does take some mental energy to get there, I think it creates more value for the individual because they're trying to perform a task that is representative of the competitive experience that they're likely to undertake. So awesome fun, great conversation, really enjoyed every second, and I know there's loads of ideas there that I'm going to be taking into my sessions with the under-11s. Just hoping that I can keep their engagement and their attention and focus them on in the same way, creating sort of those contextualized game-based practices. Needless to say, we'll report back at the end of the season. Anyway, hope you got something out of that. I know I did. Have a great time with your coaching, and I'll see you next week.